I have with me Mrs. Alice Parker of Pittsburg, Texas, and by the way, I am Lacy Davis. Mrs. Parker has been very helpful to historians in this town. She has furnished many old photographs which are good in looking up history. She also knows quite a bit about the town. She's lived here a few years. She knows something about the old Pittsburgh. So I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Parker now, and she can tell you what she wants to tell you about herself and then about what she knows. And I'll probably ask her some questions later on.
I'm Alice Carson Parker. I was born in Pittsburgh, 302 Mount Pleasant Street. The time I was born, the house didn't have a house number on it, though. I was born in September the 27th, 1906. And my parents were William Henry Carson and Sophie Kirschbaum Carson. I was the youngest of 7 children. And I had 3 brothers and 1 sister living, and 1 brother and 1 sister died at birth. And I have 5 children, and all 5 of my children were born in the same house that I was born in. We didn't have a hospital in Pittsburgh in those days. And my sister's son was born in that house. So there's lots of history for our family in that house. My grandfather bought it in 1887, in July, and then my father bought it from him in December of 1887, and they had some work done on it, and they moved into it July the 1st, 1888.
One thing, can you give us your grandfather's name? We didn't get that in there.
Carl George Kirschbaum. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and his parents came from Germany. He was a first-generation American, and his wife's name was Margaret Ann Reedy, and her parents came from Ireland, and she's a first-generation American. And my mother was born in St. Louis, Missouri. My father was born in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. And let me see. I've been told that in 1898 my father had the house worked over and put in curly pine. He was in the lumber business, and he had saved the best pieces of curly pine lumber. And he had the house all on the inside. The paneling and woodwork was curly pine. And I sold the house in 1987 to Betty McWaters Shirello, and she was having it worked over, and I guess ran out of money. I don't know the real reason, but she didn't complete renovating the house. She was going to have a bed and breakfast there. I started school in 1913. My brother, who was 11 years older than I, took me to school the first day. Miss Clara Buckingham was my teacher, and or would have been my teacher, but she got me up in front of the class, and I was very timid, and she wanted me to read in the Playmates Primer. I knew all the words, but I was afraid to open my mouth. So Mrs. Sears had a kindergarten in the school that year, and they put me back in that kindergarten. Well, with my birthday like it was, by the time I got to the 1st grade, I was 8 years old.
Where was this school located?
The same place that the high school, the one that burned. That was the...
Down on Lafayette Street?
On Lafayette Street.
Okay.
That was the one that I went to. And I went to school until I was in my junior year, and I got sick and had to miss that year, and then I didn't want to go back. And we went to Arizona and stayed 2 years, my mother, my sister, and I. And that was the end of my public schooling. But later, I enrolled in that American school in Chicago and got my high school diploma through them. But before I got the high school diploma, I went to Fort Worth and took the GED test when I was about 56 years old and got my GED, so I have both of them now.
Now this school you from Chicago, was that a correspondence course?
Correspondence
Okay.
course. And I made good grades in all of it, and I even took that new math. But I had my old Wentworth math and could work the problems by going back to that. I don't like that new math. It doesn't have any rules to go by like the old math did. And I married Herschel Thurman Parker in 1927, and we went to Hot Springs and lived up there almost a year, and then came back to Pittsburg, like most people do, that had once lived in Pittsburg. And we had the 5 children: Herschel Edwin, Sophie Alice, Charles Raymond, Margaret Ann, and William Carson. We called William Billy.
Now your husband was a motion picture projector. Was that what all he did? When I knew him, that's what he was.
That was his main livelihood, but he could have been an electrician, and he just didn't get enough of education to be able to get jobs where he could have made a good living. If he'd gone to school like he should have, he would have been better off. And we lived together a little more than 10 years and then separated, and about 3 years later I got a divorce.
Now you live and walk by, I know, the old Jeff Davis College, or school as it was known. What can you tell us about it?
Well, my mother told me to stay away from it. And I did go up to the door a time or two and looked in, but I was afraid to go in because she had told me it might fall in on me. They had a well out there in the yard, and I was not supposed to go near that either. And in later years, when the A&P was there was a sunken place in their parking lot, and I told them that's where the well was. I guess it had caved in again, or had gotten too much water and caved in or something. And they filled that in again. And I don't remember when it was torn down. It could have been while we were in Arizona. And then the old courthouse, though, that was on Main Street, I was working at the Crystal Theater as a cashier when that was torn down. It was in the summer of 1932. And dust, and it was a red brick, and the red brick dust was terrible, all in that end of town. And I remember when I was a little girl, the main street of town wasn't paved, and it evidently didn't have any drains. And I remember seeing one time at least, when we'd had lots of rain, the water was from curb to curb, and you couldn't get across the street until after that had finally drained off. And on Main Street, Mr. Robinson had what they called a racket store. It was a variety store. Miss Mamie Thomas worked there, and his daughter Nina worked there. And
can you pinpoint that location a little better for us, on north or south, and what block?
It was on the north side, about the middle of the block that, what block would that be? Where B&S Hardware is now.
B&S is now, okay.
It was about in the middle of that block. Mr. Walters, a little later, I don't know whether how long he had a furniture store just west of the variety store. But Mr. Robinson would go to lunch, and while he was gone, the girls working in there would kind of fall down on the job. And they were supposed to be keeping things straight and clean and what have you. So my brother George was going home. It had been raining, and he had an umbrella with him. And Miss Mamie Thomas told him that if Mr. Robinson was coming out the door when he passed the house for him to raise the umbrella and they'd get busy. So when he went along, he raised the umbrella. And they got busy and nearly worked themselves to death, and Mr. Robinson didn't come for another hour. And then later I worked there. When I was about 10 years old, I started working there, helping them, and I'm sure I was more of a nuisance than a help, but I could climb and fix things. Around Christmas time, they would put up boards, little narrow boards, and decorate those and over the counters, and I helped them do those things. And later then, they gave me a counter of my own, and I was so proud. And I had little dolls on it, and somebody swiped one of the dolls. But I kept up with all the things, so I knew that it was gone, but I didn't know who got it. And
now, on that side of the street, I have an old picture which shows Keeling Taylors on that street, on that side of the street.
On the north side?
On the north side. And someone told me, I believe G.W. told me before he died, that they were originally on the north side. And yet I talked to someone else and they say they were up in the next block, but the picture shows them in that block. Do you really have any recollection of that?
I don't remember that.
That might have been before your time.
It was probably before my time of paying attention to things like that. Hopkins Brothers had a tailor shop, but I don't know just where that was. It could have been on that side, and then the Keelings bought them out.
That's possible.
And we're not there very long. I don't know about that, because as far back as I remember, the Keelings were there next to the old Crystal Theater.
Well, that's where I knew them.
Mr. Holmesley owned and operated the Crystal Theater when I was growing up, and Papa liked to go to the picture show, and of course we didn't get the car out to go to the picture show. That was unheard of. We didn't live but 3 blocks from town. So Mama didn't, he was getting older. He was 76 when he died, and Mama didn't like for him to walk up there. She was afraid he might fall coming home, stumble on the sidewalk. It wasn't real smooth. And she would always send me to the show with Papa. And of course I was glad of that. And I remember Miss Holmesley sitting there on the front row. She always had a baby in a buggy, and she'd roll that buggy to keep the baby quiet. And they had a large Wurlitzer, if that's the way you pronounce it,
I think so.
Electric organ. And it had large rolls, and you could put one roll in and it would play the entire evening. And I don't know whether that was controlled from the projection room or not, but I know when Herschel worked there, he could make it go faster, but I don't know how, it must have been controlled from the projection room.
Possible.
Because when the show was getting excited, he'd get the music a little faster.
That's these westerns when they were chasing bad men, I suppose.
I guess so.
Now, as I recalled in the old theater, the projection room was originally at the rear of the building and
Yes.
screen at the front.
Yes.
And then later on, probably after Herschel didn't work there anymore, they changed it, screen at the rear and the projection room up front. Okay, now let's go from there to the Northeast Texas Fair. Well, wait a minute, before we go that far, you mentioned your dad and family's car. Do you remember the first year he bought a car? Or do you
I believe it was 1908.
1908, that's
And my nephew in Gainesville, however, he's dead now, but he had the license plate that came off of it, and it was a large numeral 2. It was brass, and it was on a kind of a leather, about so large, and this large 2. And I have a picture of it. And Mr. Prince had the first car, and Papa had the second car.
Now, I guess that 2 meant for this county.
That was their license plate.
I see.
They
Well,
were
Mrs.
first and second. I guess his was number 1.
Mrs. Dorothy Brownlee told me recently that the first license plates were leather. So I'm glad to know that.
This was
Yeah,
a thick leather.
I see.
It was black, and I'll show you that picture sometime.
Okay. Now let's go back to the fair and tell me what you know about it, when it was started, about who the directors were, or owners. I suppose the owners and directors were one and the same, and anything you might tell us about the fair.
Well, I don't know too much about the fair. Now, Papa had stock in it, but and I still have that certificate. But when I was a very small girl, I remember going to the fair, and they would bring the attractions that they showed in front of the grandstand. They would bring those from the Dallas Fair here, and then from here they would go to the Shreveport, Louisiana State Fair.
I see.
And I remember the Duntons. They had white horses, and the people were all dressed in, it was kind of an off-white, it wasn't a white, and everything was the same color. Their faces, their hair, the horses, everything, and they would do these tableaus, and they'd have a curtain, and then they'd take it off, and everything was just perfectly still, and then they'd pull the curtain, and then they'd get into another position, and that was interesting to me. And then they had horse races there. I didn't like those much, and I had been told that one horse fell and was pierced by a post, but if I was there at that time, I don't remember seeing it. And then a man with an airplane came, and I remember that faintly, and more from having a picture of it.
Now this picture, I believe I have a copy of it that you let me have, and this picture had 3 wheels on the airplane. Now I recall that later on there were 2 planes there, and they had only 2 wheels and probably biplanes, and that there was some transferring done from one plane to the other. You remember that?
No.
Well,
I don't think I do. I didn't like to look at things like that. And I didn't like the trapeze artists, and when they'd, fly through the air. I didn't like that either. So I'd hide my face. But they had lots of attractions there, and then they had fortune tellers and carnival glass. I can remember seeing those booths with all that yellow carnival glass, and I wouldn't try for that, but I tried for the Cupid dolls, and I won several Cupid dolls. But through the years, they have all gotten broken, and I wish I had 1 or 2 of them now.
Do you recall any of the bands in particular that was there? Now I do know that back in its heyday, the Fair Association brought bands from possibly up north or somewhere else, and of course, since the fair ran 2 weeks, I don't recall ever, unless it was in later years, that they used a local band. They always used a big band from somewhere else. I recall one year that they had the Hardin Simmons Cowboy Band from Abilene, and one year they had a Highland band, I believe it's from Chicago, and of course they all wore the kilts. And do you remember that Ruth Garrison, the young girl, got out there on the stage and danced with Scottish attire on herself? I don't know whether you remember that or not.
No, I don't. It's possible that I wasn't there at that time.
It's possible.
I liked the Midway better than I did the attractions over there in front of the grandstand. And of course they had cotton candy. And one year Mama and I and Papa were walking with the crowd going across there by that little Reynolds Pond that's still there. And the fire whistle blew. And Mama had a silk scarf over her arm, and it frightened her so, and she dropped her arms and lost her scarf. And I guess it was tangled up in somebody else's feet.
Now you called that pond Reynolds Pond, is that right? Do you know how it got its name?
No.
Okay.
But as far back as I can remember, it was called Reynolds Pond, and a little Negro boy drowned in it one time.
I see.
But that was I've just heard Mama tell about that. That might have been before my time. But When the courthouse was torn down, Mr. W.A. Kennedy bought the vault and had it moved over a little distance there on Tapp Street, and used it for his office for a number of years. And after he died, G.W. Keeling bought the vault and had it moved out and put in his backyard, and he stored pictures and things that he would like to keep in the vault, because they were gone on trips and he was afraid his house something might happen, or it'd burn or something, and his pictures would be lost. And they may have some old pictures out there that would be helpful to the town. I don't know. I don't know what
I've talked to G.W. and he didn't indicate that he had any this before he died.
Probably they were just family pictures.
Yes.
And Mr. O.B. Colquitt, who later became governor of Texas, was the first owner of the Pittsburg Gazette. And then he started it in February the 13th, 1884, and he sold it to his brother W.F. Colquitt, and then he sold it to Mr. Lockhart, and Mr. Lockhart and his two sons, Bert and Frank, ran it, but Frank decided he'd go into the diplomatic service, and he went to Washington and lived up there, and Bert continued with the Gazette, and then Bert's son-in-law helped him, and then Bert's grandson helped when he came back to Pittsburgh. They were all living here. And this Colquitt was related to this Mrs. Robinson, whose husband ran the racket store. I think it was through his wife that there was a relationship. And Mrs. Aldrich was Mrs. Robinson's sister. And they were Merrills or Murrells, I don't know the correct pronunciation. And Ms. Aldrich had 5 girls, and she moved to Denton after her husband died and put the girls through college. She kept roomers and boarders and put the girls through college. And her father, I believe it was her father, no, it was Miss Ruby's father, so it was her husband, I guess, gave the first part of the cemetery. They had a child to die, a little boy, and they had owned a lot of land out there, so he gave part of the land for a cemetery. I guess nobody had died, or if they'd died, they'd been taken somewhere else. And he kept it up for a while, and then he turned it over to the Masonic Lodge, and they kept it up for a while, and then they turned it over to the city. And it has been a city cemetery ever since. And Mrs. H.Y. Black kept up with it for a long time, and Mrs. Garrett, Bridget Garrett, kept up with it. And then I think the city took it over after Miss Bridget got, so she couldn't handle it. There's been lots of dairies in Kemp County. They've come and gone and prospered or not prospered. And corn and cotton were major crops for a long time. And then Irish potatoes, then sweet potatoes, watermelons, peaches. And now most of the land is in grassland, and they cut hay and pasture and have cattle.
Okay, you mentioned dairies. You want to tell us a little about Princedale?
No, I don't know anything about that.
Okay, Mr. Prince, who ran the box factory, had a dairy out here on the Dangerfield Highway, and that's where the golf course is now. He ran a dairy out there for a number of years called Princedale, and later after the dairy, after he quit operating it, he gave the land to the group to form a golf club. So that's where it's got its name, from the Princedale Dairy, which was out there. And I don't want to get away and get your story, but
well, the swimming pool was out there on the Kent's Kent's owned part of that land, though, that is now
Yes.
golf land, golf course.
That was the west side of it.
And they had a swimming pool out there, and we used to walk out there and go swimming. And then when my children came along, they walked out there and would go swimming and get sunburned, have a hard time.
We were talking about that a few days ago. He called that natatorium. And
Yeah.
very few swimming pools have I ever heard of being called a natatorium. I guess that was the name which was used back in those when it started.
Well, when we were in Colorado, they had the building was called a natatorium, but they had a swimming pool in the building. You know, they've changed so many of these words that varsity, when that word started, it was short for university, and it was mostly for rowing teams.
Mhm.
In fact, that's the first time I heard of it. It was in Wisconsin, and they had this race of these boats, and the varsity of the University of Wisconsin. But now, even down in the grades in the schools, their teams are called varsity teams.
Right.
So they've changed the meaning of a lot of words, and I don't know about natatorium.
Now, you mentioned a minute ago about the racket store, and some of these young folks who might at some time or other be looking at this might not know what a racket store was. Now, a racket store has changed into a variety store, 5 and 10, and I don't know whether you call it department store now or just
I don't know what they're called, but they're not what they used to be. In the late teens and early 20s, Mr. Tuck Carpenter, D.H. Dwight Hayes Carpenter, who was sheriff for 26 years here, had goats, sheep, and cattle on his farm east of town. He had the sheep sheared and sold the wool. And one time he had a goat barbecued down there, and that was the best meat. It was a young goat. Mr. DeWitt Carpenter had the first Piggly Wiggly in Pittsburg, along where Faye's shop is now in that area. I don't remember exactly which building because they've been cut up into smaller buildings. And Mrs. Gladys Claus had a dress shop, but this was during the war, I believe. She started her dress shop in her home on the corner of Texas and Quitman Street. And Mrs. Myrtle Moore worked for her. She was her only employee. And then later, DeWitt Carpenter's daughter-in-law, Nan, started a dress shop upstairs in Mr. Carpenter's building, and her sister came down from Sulphur Springs every day and helped her with the dresses, and that was the beginning of Mike Benet formals. And some businesses that were on the main street of Pittsburg were the Vidette. It was a newspaper, and it was along where the Parker Plumbing is now. It was in that block. And they, I believe they stayed in business until probably the Depression started.
One thing about the Vidette, I recall, they had a funny paper strip in it, and the Pittsburgh Gazette didn't. In those days, I thought Vidette was a big newspaper because it had there's just one comic strip there, but it was in there.
Then on down on the corner of Rusk Street, and I guess Jefferson Street starts there at that street light.
At the intersection of red light.
On the corner, Hopkins and Grammer had a store there, and Cockwood Hopkins worked in it, and later, after his father died, he became part owner of it, and I think he bought out Mr. Grammer later.
Later on, I know that Perry Brothers was there at one time. Then there's been several different ones there from time to time now.
The building was enlarged, though. It wasn't that large. And then I believe next door, there was a Julian Lockett had a photography shop there, and later he moved upstairs across the street where Dr. Trainum's office was, in that same building. And Mrs. Belle A. Taylor had a little shop next door to pardon me, to that, and she sold penny candy and pencils and tablets and cards and school supplies and greeting cards and things. And then Mr. Julius, his Palace of Sweets confectionery was next to that, and he made the best candy, especially marshmallows. And a little farther down, and all in the same location, but the owners changed. There was Bland's Grocery and Smith and Shell Grocery and Thompson's Grocery. It was all the one store, but the owners changed at different times. And farther down, Mr. Skipper had a jewelry and watch repair shop. And the Chevrolet was where Hazelwood is now.
The Gazette office was back up between there and well, west of the Hazelwood part, or part of that building for a long time too.
And then there was another little shop in there, and it was a paint and paper.
There's Miss Charlie Dick Swayze.
Miss Charlie Dick Swayze later had a shop in there. I don't know what was in there earlier, unless they just cut off a place for that shop. And of course the Crystal Theater and the H.H. Keeling Tailor Shop. And Miss Estelle Fisher had a hat shop along there also. I believe that was before Mr. Skipper had his shop along there. And her sister, I believe it was Mrs. Inez Upchurch, I believe was her sister. And she was a relative anyway. And she helped her in her hat shop.
Okay, why don't we go to the post offices, since you were down in that area there. Now, I know that the post office at one time was in long about that area too, before the present post office was built.
Yes, it was. The post office was in three different, it's been moved 3 different times that I have known of. It was in the far end of town, west end of town, to begin with. And then
north or south block?
It's on the south side.
South side.
Mm-hmm. And then it moved down there in one of those buildings close to where Hazelwood is now, in that area.
I really believe it's where the Mabin shop is now. I'm not sure.
It could have been. And at that time they were putting in the locked boxes that had combinations.
Right.
And our box number was 355, and we had been in Idaho Springs, Colorado, and they had the combination boxes up there, and I had learned how to work them. So we kids after school would stop in there, the door was open, and we'd go in and try to work the combination on our box. And I finally worked it on ours. It was 8 1/2 back to 5. And I was so proud of myself because I could do that. And then later, that building was built. I don't know which came. I believe Mr. Bradley's building came first, and that was joined
Mr.
up.
Bradley's building was 1918, and the post office was built in 1925.
Mm-hmm. Well,
now the Crystal Theater building, I don't know when.
I don't know when it was built.
That's
it
where
was
the
there ever since I
bookstore is
can
now.
remember. But along about 1914, 1915, I think is when I first became acquainted with town. I stayed at home, or I went across the old school, Jeff Davis school lot, going to town, or going to the school, and I didn't go through town very often. But one time I had a post office key tied on the corner of my handkerchief, and I was slinging it up and catching it, and I slung it up just in time for it to fall on the awning on Mr. Bradley's building. And I didn't know how in the world I was going to get it. So I knew Mr. Bradley. Papa and Mr. Bradley were good friends, and he would come down and eat at our house many times. And if he went squirrel hunting, Mama always cooked the squirrels for him. He and Miss Bradley were separated. They didn't see eye to eye about something, and they separated, and he lived upstairs in his building. And so I went up there and asked him if he could help me to get down there on that awning and get my post office key. So he let me crawl through the window, and he held my hands, and I dropped down on the awning, got the key, and then he pulled me back up again. So I didn't throw that key up anymore either.
What kind of business did he operate? Was he a gun man? I had the impression he was.
I really don't know what he did for a living.
Well, I don't either.
And he was Mr. Charlie Dorfman's father-in-law.
I see.
Mrs. Dorfman was his daughter. I guess
George Spearman, the Lightfoots were related there somewhere or another to the Bradleys too. I'm not sure.
I don't
That's how they
know.
would. Now let me ask you a question. I've asked it before. Over across North Avenue from the post office, the Pittsburg service station was on the front of that lot, and the Howard and Stewart had a potato house on the back part of that lot. Do you know when they were built, or when the Pittsburg service station first went into business there? And I know that originally there were some school kindergartens there on that lot.
Well, the kindergartens were back up this way, where the post office is now. There was a long building and had steps all the way across it. And Miss Carrymore or Mrs. Carrymore had a kindergarten in there. And I never did go to her, but she was there, and I think Julian Lockett had his photography shop, and evidently the buildings were partitioned off and
Yes.
small. I don't know whether there were 3 or 4. And then all that was torn down when I was quite young, because I just have a faint recollection of it. And the reason I know Julian Lockett was there, when I was about 7 years old, Mama dressed me up and I had on white shoes, and she sent me up to have my picture made. And in walking across that path by the old Jeff Davis College, it was early morning and dew was on the grass, and I got dust on my toes. I walked in the grass first and got them wet, the toe wet, and then I walked in the dirt and got dirt on my toe. And I went on and had my picture made full length. And when Mama got that picture, she was so unhappy about that dirt on the toe of my shoe. And that's the reason that I know Julian Lockett was there when I was about 7 years old.
I have heard, well, I have seen some old photos, and they had the name J.D. Boyd underneath them, and they were made around the turn of the century. And then I have found out that Julian Lockett, as a youngster, went up to that shop and began to learn the trade, and that his first business was there, and that would tie in with your story. So Mr. Boyd was there ahead of him in this building.
And I guess when Mr. Boyd died or moved or whatever he did, Julian took over.
Julian took over, then moved up Europe, more uptown later on.
I have quite a few pictures of different family members, and Mr. Boyd's name is on them.
Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought there on these old businesses. You may want to go across the street now.
Well, you were asking about that filling station, and it must have been built in the later 20s, because the corner there where the Masonic building is now was a vacant building around 1930. I mean, a vacant lot.
Yes.
Because they had a big picture show sign there, and Herschel would put those signs up on it, you know, with paste. And the old Lon Morris house was still there, I believe, along about that time. So it must have been just before the Depression that they built that.
Well, now the Pittsburg service station that I'm talking about was over on the corner where the State Bank parking lot is now, right next to the North Avenue there. And on the back was the old...
next to the Presbyterian Church at first. Yeah, that's right. And then it moved across the street.
Yes, and I just wonder if you remember when the original one was built.
No.
Buddy Hughes might be able to help us sometime. I'll ask him. He worked there for a long time.
I wonder if Cecil could remember.
I don't know. I thought about it, but I don't know whether Cecil could. I've heard that he's not where we could talk to him.
I didn't know how
But
he was.
that vacant lot across the street where the Masonic building is now was Lon Morris's flower garden, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay,
And then after they were gone, it was just a weed patch.
okay.
And the Presbyterian Church, the filling station stayed open on Sunday and made so much noise that the Presbyterian people decided they would sell that building and build somewhere else. So they sold it to the American Legion, and then later the American Legion sold it to the Mormons, and they moved it up on Hill Avenue. In the meantime, the Presbyterians bought that lot where the Presbyterian Church is now from Mrs. Fanny Roberts, and Dr. Pitt bought about 2/3 of the lot. It was deeper on one side than it was on the other, and he bought the deeper side. And the church was built, and that was in 1949. And my sister's funeral was the second funeral in it. The benches had to be screwed down. Henry James was the first one the day before. The benches had to be screwed down so that they could have the funeral, the two funerals. And then the filling station moved over there right by the Presbyterian Church again.
Right.
But they don't, the way it was situated, the noise doesn't bother now. Kate Clark had a dress shop, and I believe she started that in the 1930s to help send her son James to college. And then after she didn't need it anymore, she sold it to Mary Shell, and it was along, at first, close to the Gazette office. I don't remember which side of the Gazette office it was on.
I don't
I
either.
guess that was where that paint and wallpaper shop was later.
Okay.
Then Mary moved it up where the barber shop had been, next to where J.B. White is now. And then across the street, Mr. Sullivan had a dry goods store, and he had a great big pot-bellied stove in the back, and different people would go in and sit with his wife and his daughter, and in the wintertime, and get warm. And one lady sat so close to the stove she blistered her legs. And then on the corner where the Johns are now was the Camp County Bank, and that was owned by Mr. Lon Morris. I remember seeing him in there lots of times. The doors would be open. And earlier, where Fay is, was Dr. Ellington's drugstore. And then just west of that was Mrs. Cabness's hat shop. And Dr. Ellington and his family had a home on Dangerfield Street where Weldon Reynolds lives now. But in the wintertime, they would move up over the store. I guess it was warmer up there. I don't know. I don't know what the reason was. But I took music lessons from Miss May Ellington, and I'd have to come from school and go up there and take the lessons. And I was in one recital, and that was enough for me. And then Mr. Sarge had a grocery store a little farther west of that, of Miss Cabness's place, and I don't know, I believe he sold to Nathan Lee.
No, Mr. Riding bought that
Mr.
store
Riding.
and operated for a very short length of time.
And
Then
then-
Nathan Lee, I think, went in there.
Bought it. And then Mr. Madison, that racket store, dime store, variety store, whatever it would be called, Mr. Madison, J.G. Madison, bought it after Nina Robinson left here, and she and Miss Mamie Thomas dissolved partnership, and he bought that, and then Miss Mamie Thomas put in a store across the street in Mr. Bradley's building. But she was an elderly person then, and she didn't keep it. I don't know whether she kept it more than a year or not. And then Jack Curtis's barber shop was along there, and George Rumsey started working for him, and then he put in his own barber shop, or he bought Jack's, I believe, when Jack got so he couldn't work.
But I think he ran another one for you in the meantime. I'm not sure. Wasn't he up about where close Clark Brothers with Mr. Mount Pleasant Street? I can't think of his name now.
Jim Williams.
Jim Williams.
Well, Jim was in with Mr. Warwick, wasn't he?
Maybe so. Don't let me interrupt your train of thought.
I don't remember for sure, but there was a barber shop up there, and there was also a little cafe up there. I don't know whether they were both there at the same time, close to where Don Reynolds' flower shop is now. And in fact, I believe the Clark's Grocery was one store west when the father Clark owned it, and then I don't know whether it was moved when during his lifetime, or whether it was during, I believe that was after the boys took over, Marvin and Jimmy. And they had the store worked over and had a big opening, and insisted, Mama didn't go to town much, her feet hurt, and she'd send me or somebody else after what she wanted, and she'd order her groceries. And she was a good customer of theirs, and they wanted her to come up there, and they insisted, so she went to this opening of their refurbished store. And in that store, after they had cold soda pops, Marvin was putting a bottle of soda pop in, they had water in there and kept it cold. I believe they had to put ice in it at that time. And he stuck a hot bottle of soda pop down in that ice water, and it exploded and put out the glass hit one of his eyes and put it out. And he had to have a glass eye. But it was such a realistic glass eye, I couldn't tell which was the right,
you had to look
the good eye and the bad eye. And then Jimmy and he dissolved partnership later on, but Jimmy continued to work for him until his death. And Vannie Townsend, who later married Jack Curtis, had a little hem-stitching shop there close to the barber shop, and Mr. Franklin, Johnny Franklin's father, I don't know his name now.
Dave Franklin.
Dave Franklin had a shoe shop there. They were just little kind of hole-in-the-wall places.
Now that was down there in where B&S is in that block later on, but I think he moved down there from up there to the other place, didn't he?
No, his place burned. He was up there when it burned.
I see.
Next to the barber shop.
Okay.
And because...
now that's in the block where B&S is now, you're talking about now.
Yes, it's in the west part of it, though.
Okay.
The bank was there on the corner, and then later it was turned, after the bank failed, First National Bank. And after it failed, then that was turned into a cafe, and Fred Bevel had the Al Cafe there. And then later, Princeton had it. I think Fred thought he was going to retire and let Princeton take over. And then he decided he didn't want to retire, and he put in a cafe. That was after that burn, though. He put in a cafe around on Tapp Street in a building around there.
Now the Al Cafe, wasn't the original Al Cafe down in the
west part of town on the south side of the street. And during one of the fair one year, but that was after 1927, Herschel and I ate lunch in there. In those days, we didn't eat out much. We didn't have any money, for one thing, and then it just wasn't the thing to do. And then Abernathy, Ludeck and Company was on the corner, and they had the two buildings on the corner of Mount Pleasant Street and Whitman Street. And it was a big store, and Miss Jessie Mallory had a hat shop in the balcony. And it was a real nice department store. And then Mr. Center worked there, and he sold shoes, and he would invariably sell them too narrow or too short. and he's the reason I can't walk very well right now. And then later, Mr. Ludek moved to Austin, and Mr. Criddell, or Criddle we called him at that time, bought an interest in it, and then later Mr. Center bought an interest in it, so it was called Abernathy, Criddell, and Center. And then Mr. Center became incapacitated and moved to Kentucky to his people, and Mr. Abernathy died, and his son Walter took over and kept it a long time. And then I don't know whether he died and then left the store was sold then or not.
I think it was sold before he died. I'm not sure. Now, Paul Clayton operated that store at one time. Was his name? Did he buy it? This is younger Paul.
Yeah, younger Paul bought it,
now,
I believe.
Didn't Oliver Bolton and them run the store there at one time, or am I mistaken there?
I believe Ms. Bolton worked for
That's
him
probably what it was.
after Mr. Dolinsky died.
Okay.
Then Mr. Dolinsky's nephew, I guess it was, Mr. Dolan, came and had a store there, and she worked for Mr. Dolan later. And Perry Brothers had a store just west of Clark's Grocery. And one Christmas, I had the children's things out, and I decided Margaret didn't have as much as some of the rest of them. And about 10:30 at night, I walked to town to get a doll for Margaret to have. And she didn't care about dolls. She'd rather have had a football.
I worked during the Christmas season for Perry Brothers, first in that store, and then when they moved over in the Hopkins Grammar building, I worked some over there a little bit, so I know about those two stores. Mm-hmm. Okay, now go ahead. Now, after the Perry Brothers moved out, I believe Mr. Wallace came here and run the country store for just a short while, and then later on, I believe R.A. Hazelwood or his next building.
Well, I believe Hazelwood had where Wallace was, didn't he?
I'm not sure. Now, there was
that's where he started.
Bo Smith's store in there too, so I don't recall which was which.
Well, Smith's was a little farther west, if I remember right.
Okay.
And those storefronts have been changed, so it's kind of hard to remember for
partitions have been moved too.
Mm-hmm. Mr. W.A. Smith had a store in there, and his two sons worked in there with him, or two of his sons. I don't know whether he had more than that.
Yes, he had Walter. Walter went to Nashville.
And was he the one who made a dentist of himself, or didn't one of them make a dentist?
He was a dentist, yes. That was Walter.
They just had menswear, I believe, in there. And then Holman's Hardware was next, and then he went out of business, and Mr. Crumpler and Mr. Nelson went in the hardware business there, and they also were undertakers. And in the back of their store, they had caskets, not very many, I don't guess, because I don't remember seeing any. And I don't know whether they took people up there and embalmed them in the back of the store.
There wasn't much embalming done at that time. They had to get Mr. Mont Wagner from Winsboro, I believe. He came over. I believe he actually worked for him while he did the embalming back in those days. But now, you said they took over from Holman. Did Holman do any funeral undertaking, as you recall?
If he did, I don't know it.
I didn't recall that he did.
Now, he sold Edison's because Papa bought an Edison from him, and I remember going up there and buying some records from him.
Now, the Edison was Ashton Holman, Mr. Holman's son. I recall Ashton had that agency himself.
Oh, did he?
And one time, I guess they were fixing to close out that store, and Mr. Ashton, see, my dad worked there at that time. He had him move out to our garage, some 15 or 20 of these Edison, that had the little tube-type cylinder disc on them. Not cylinder disc, but the cylinder records on them. Brand new ones out to our garage. And later on, he came back and got them. I don't know what the reason for. That's the reason I knew that Mr. Ashton
Well,
was
he
in his
probably
nose.
had to vacate the building, don't you suppose?
Could be, could be.
Papa had one of those old Edisons that had the round discs, and it got so it wouldn't work, and then it had that huge horn.
Yes.
And I've often wondered what became of that. I don't know where it went to. I used to like to turn it on. It would turn on and run, but it wouldn't play anymore for some reason. But he bought this other Edison, and I remember going to the old opera house, and some famous woman came and sang, and she sang by herself. She was promoting Edison's, I guess, and I kind of think this was during 1917, during the war, or 1918. It was in the wintertime. And then she would stand by the Edison and turn it on, and she would mouth the song, and you couldn't tell whether she was singing or whether it was the Edison.
I see.
It was so clear.
Now the Opera House, you might as well tell them where that was.
Well, that was on Rusk Street, at the corner of Rusk Street and Marshall Street. And Mr. Carnegie gave $5,000 to the city of Pittsburg to have a Carnegie Library built. And it was the first Carnegie Library in Texas. And according to some papers that I have, there were 31 in all, but ours was the first. And Mr. Johnny Reynolds got the idea that if the city would put some money with it, they could build an opera house and a city hall and have the library upstairs. And it was in one room across the front of the building. And then downstairs they had, on either side of the hall, they had the city hall on one side, and I don't know exactly what they used the other side for. I know they voted in there because I helped with an election one November in there. And upstairs, I kept the library when Ms. Minnie Garrett was the librarian. She would go to Tyler to visit her children, and I would keep it. And it was open on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoon. And I think it was 50 cents a year then to belong to it.
I see.
But they had lots of books, and I enjoyed reading, so I had a good time staying up there. We didn't have very many patrons then. But some boys were playing with firecrackers and got one in some tar, wasn't it? A barrel of tar, and the tar flew up.
Well, the tar was on top of the building, I believe, and they threw firecrackers up there. They were repairing the building, the roof.
I was thinking there was a barrel of tar there, and it flew up. Maybe the tar was up there. I don't remember exactly how, but anyway, it caught it on fire, and they thought they had it put out, but that night it flamed up again and burned that time. But a good many of the books were rescued, and some of the chairs that were up there, I don't know whether all of the city records were gotten out or not. I don't believe they were. The first Guarantee Bank was on the corner of, I guess that would be called Compress Street,
right,
because it was Compress Street farther down, and Quitman Street. And then later the name was changed to the First State Bank. And across from that, I don't know who was in that building a long time ago, but Alton Hill started a grocery store there, and his sons worked there. And I believe one of Horace Hudnall's sons, the one who was killed in the service, I believe he worked there also. And then Mr. R.P. Nichols had a automobile and parts place next to that. And then my brother George Carson bought him out, and they had a gasoline pump out in front of that place, sold gasoline. And by that time radios were coming in, and George put in some radios and sold those as well as the cars and car parts.
For the record, let's clarify just exactly where that is. That is the block just west of the old State Bank or old State Bank building,
Yes.
or where Holman was.
And it's the second building from the corner
Okay.
where that was. And then the Western Union office was down there part of the time, and also a cafe, and it was owned by several different people at different times. And on the corner, in that little triangle place, Vernon Williams had a filling station. And that was back in the 20s, early 20s. And he, I guess, was about the only filling station except for the gas pump in front of George's place and a gas pump down in front of the grocery store Smith and Shell. I don't remember filling stations being prevalent then.
They were not. Now, his was called Best Yet.
Best
Now,
Yet.
Mr. Walter Bryson was involved in that place too. They were related. I don't know whether he just
I
helped
don't know
him
whether
or
he
what.
worked there. He probably had an interest in it too.
Probably.
And then a long time ago, the ice plant was down by the railroad, and Mr. Wallace worked there. And the day, well, in Pittsburg, when the armistice was signed after World War I, somehow word got back to the United States on the 10th of November, the days being different over there. And we celebrated on the 10th of November. And they blew the fire whistle, and I went with the Wallace girls up there and helped Mr. Wallace blow the fire whistle. And then we went up on Main Street, and people were riding. They had cars then. They were riding up and down the street in cars and hollering and carrying on. Everybody was so happy that the war was over. And then we found out it was the next day that the war was over officially. And then they moved the ice plant up on Main Street, on Quitman Street, by the railroad again. And Parvin Swaim was the manager of it. And Mr. Can't think of that man's name that worked there. Arnold. Mr. Arnold worked
Yes.
in the office.
But then the ice plant, Mr. Wallace was over there, and Mr. Reardon was worked there, and then Mr. Alvis worked there at one time.
Yes, he did. And he was Oscar Hughes' father-in-law. And there was another man that worked there later, and he married Christine King's mother, married Miss King, and they lived down on Mount Pleasant Street in the Mackwaters house. But I can't
I don't recall
his name.
his name.
They called it the ice plant and home light office. And then later it was sold to the Southwestern Light Company. And the Denman Lumber Company was along where that carpet place is now. And I'm not sure whether Mr. Cruz bought it from the Denmans or whether somebody else was in there between that, but Mr. Cruz bought it. It was a Cruz Lumber Company for a long, long time. And after he died, then his wife, Miss Fowler Cruz, ran it. And then when she got to retirement age, she sold it to, was that E.P. Mabin?
Andy Mabin.
Andy Mabin. And he ran it. Well, first though, Mr. Irby, Shorty Irby, ran it a while. Then she sold it to Mr. Mabin. And then he finally retired and closed it out. And coming back up on Main Street, we've already talked about the Owl Cafe being down there. And Mr. Charlie Dorfman had a clothing, dry goods, and coal store. He ordered coal for the winter time. And we used to have wood stoves, but I think coal was easier to get and cheaper. So Papa had coal stoves put in the house. And we still had some wood stoves, though, I remember, upstairs. And Mr. Dorfman, as I said, was Mr. Bradley's son-in-law. And then coming east along there where Mr. Red Parker has his storage place, that was a variety store. And it had quite a few different owners, but the Hopkins brothers were ones that I remember being there. And then there were several other people who had more or less department stores. Most of them were Jews. And one man was showing his clerk how to measure lace, and he said, "Stretch it when you measure it, stretch it." You didn't get quite your money's worth, I guess. And then on the corner was Arthur Jackson's grocery store, and Mrs. Jackson helped him with that. And then he sold out to Carol King, and Carol ran a grocery store and meat market there. He had been around on Marshall Street, and he had a hot links place back there.
Now before that, Mr. Paul Clayton operated a confectionery place there in that building.
Yes, I believe he did. And then Paul Clayton later was down a little further down on that Market Street, and that used to be called Gilmer Street. I don't know when it became Market Street.
I don't either.
But,
while we're on that, now down in that, now that was called a King Block. We'll go back now, I think Mr. E.A. King built most of those buildings, they called it King Block. But down near the railroad track down there, beyond where Dr. Pendergrass building is, where that part now has been torn down, there was the Ford Motor Company once was down there, and Mr. Pentecost run the Ford Motor Company, and if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Nichols, I know Mr. Nichols at least had a farm implement place down there. And I don't know what else has been down there in the past, but they were in those, where Stan Robinson run a garage down in those buildings, and
Patterson Electric was
Patterson Electric was down there at one time. Okay, now go ahead.
Well, I guess Mr. Nichols was down there before he went into this other store, automobile store.
Well, at some time or other, up in that block, a Davenport Variety Store was down there.
Well, it was in this building where this Hopkins Brothers Variety Store was.
Okay.
And then it moved down into our building.
Yes.
And that's where Sonny Smith is now. It's the west part of that building.
Okay.
And Louis B. Hess Haberdasher was not exactly on the corner. That corner had a little place there, and
Pittsburg Insurance Office was there.
Couch and Hooten. I believe it was called Couch and Hooten then.
That right.
And my sister worked there, Mabel. And then back of that, and I don't know whether it took in that building at that time or not, but Mr. O.C. Clark, O-C-I-E was his name.
Well, his initials were O.C. too.
Were they?
Yes.
And he had a grocery store there. And he had a large family, and they lived down on Mount Pleasant Street.
Now, in that same building back there, at one time there was a saloon back there before Mr. Clark was there, I'm told, and there was a basement or
under that?
Cave down under that. And I know when I went there with one of the Clark boys when I was a youngster, they wouldn't let us go down there because it was dark down in that cellar there, but I think they used storage.
Didn't have flashlights in those days, I guess. And then Nelson and Berry had a dry goods store. That was Mr. E.A. Nelson and Floyd Berry. And they had quality merchandise and real silk hose, $5 a pair. And then Philip Delinsky's dry goods store was next. Mrs. Feinberg, Mr. H. Fred, Mr. Harris Fred, owned that building, and his sister-in-law, Ms. Feinberg, was a widow, and she put in a dry goods store there. And then Mr. Delinsky came, Philip Delinsky came to town, and he met her, and they were both Jews, and he married her. And they had that store a long, long time, and she died, and he married again. But he owned a building in the block east of that, And during the Depression, he moved down into his own building. Miss Fanny Bolton talked him into moving there. And then that building was vacant a good while, and the OPA office was in it during the war. And then after the war, and they moved out. Davenports were in it at one time.
Well, Cecil Watson ran a grocery store there at one
Yes,
time,
he had a
too.
grocery store there. None of those stayed very long. And Davenport's moved into, after Nelson and Berry went out of business. I think Mr. Berry died, and not Berry, Mr. Nelson died, and Floyd and Mr. Nelson's son tried to run it.
I don't recall just who
I
did.
can't think what his name was. He married Florence Hargrove. And I guess times were hard then, and they just couldn't make a go of it. And Floyd went to work for W.L. Garrett, and the son went to Houston, moved down there.